I never liked early meetings, especially inside my own home. That day, I woke up with a strange feeling, as if something was out of place before I even opened my eyes. The morning light seemed too harsh, almost aggressive, through the curtains of the dining room. It was supposed to be just a quick conversation, that's what my son said. Still, they all arrived too soon, too punctual, too polite. And when my daughter-in-law smiled at me in that rehearsed way, I felt a chill run down my back. She insisted on serving coffee before we started. He insisted more than once. He said that I needed to calm down, that important meetings ask for a good cup of coffee. That sounded strange because we never had this habit. I've always hated distractions before serious decisions. I watched as she walked to the kitchen with quick, almost nervous steps. My son avoided looking at me. The others were fiddling with papers that were already organized on the table. Nothing seemed spontaneous. I sat at the headboard as I had always done for decades, but for the first time I felt that that place no longer belonged to me. They spoke to me slowly, as if I were fragile or distracted. They repeated simple phrases, explained too much. I recognized that tone. It was the same one they used when my husband died, as if widowhood had taken my lucidity with it. I took a deep breath and remained silent. Sometimes silence is the best way to listen. The smell of coffee spread through the room even before the tray appeared. Strong, bitter, invasive. My daughter-in-law came back with the cup in her hands, smiling, trying to look calm. It was then that it happened. A slight, almost imperceptible stumble. The cup escaped, hit the edge of the table, and crashed to the floor. The sound of the porcelain breaking echoed louder than it should. The coffee spread like a dark stain on the light carpet. And in that second, everything changed. The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved immediately. The eyes crossed too quickly, as if everyone was checking something that didn't go as planned. My daughter-in-law turned pale. My son put his hand to his face. Someone sighed with irritation, not concern. I observed everything, each micro-expression, every gesture restrained. That wasn't just an accident. That was an unwanted interruption. Damn it, someone muttered, thinking I wouldn't listen. They didn't ask me to move away from the broken glass out of care, but in a hurry. They wanted to solve it quickly, clean it up quickly, move on. It was there that I realized. Time was their enemy. That meeting needed to happen before I had room to think, before I asked questions, before something, or someone, got in the way of the script they had rehearsed. As the maid knelt to pick up the shards, I noticed her hands shaking. It wasn't afraid of me. It was fear of the weather. When our eyes met for a brief second, I saw something that woke me up even more. She knew. Not everything, perhaps, but he knew that this situation was not normal. That silent exchange was quick, but sufficient. For the first time that morning, I didn't feel completely alone. They resumed the conversation as if nothing had happened. They talked about documents, protection, my well-being. They used fine words to disguise harsh intentions. I nodded, feigning confusion, feigning tiredness. Inside, each piece slowly began to fit together. That hurry, that coffee, that staging, everything pointed to something greater, something that had been prepared for a long time, far from my reach, until now. When they pushed the first paper in my direction, I felt the real weight of the threat. I didn't need to read everything to understand that this was not a favor. It was an elegant trap, a polite way to get away from decisions, from my home, from my own life. I kept my hands on the table. I didn't touch the pen. I kept watching. They underestimated my silence. They thought I was already defeated. I then remembered something that I had kept for decades, a detail of the past that no one there seemed to consider. An old mistake, a buried truth, a secret that sustained everything that family built. My heart raced, not from fear, but from lucidity. Maybe that's why they were in such a hurry. Perhaps deep down they feared that I would still remember. The woman they saw sitting there was not who I really was. I've been strong before. I have faced greater losses. I have survived crueler silences. That broken cup was not an accident to me. It was a warning, a clear sign that if I didn't act intelligently, I would lose everything. And at the same time, it was the chance I needed to wake up. As the meeting continued, I was no longer there as a victim. Something had awakened within me, an old coldness, forgotten but intact. They didn't know it yet, but that morning marked the beginning of an irreversible change. From that spilled coffee, I would no longer be led. I would observe. I would plan. And when the time was right, he would make everyone hear the truth they had spent years trying to hide. The fact that you are here, listening to this story so far, already shows that you pay attention to details that many people ignore. What comes next is not just about a betrayed woman, but about silence, power, and choices that we all face at some point in life. If you believe these stories need to keep being told, subscribe. because this channel only exists as long as people like you are here. After everyone left that morning, the house became too quiet. It was not the comfortable silence I had known since I was widowed, but a fraught, suspicious silence. I walked slowly through the dining room, observing the shards of porcelain that had still been badly collected. That broken cup seemed like a perfect portrait of my position in the family, something that was already useful, but was now treated as disposable. I was always the strong woman in that house, although no one else seemed to remember it. For years, I was the one who held everything back when things fell apart. I raised my son with discipline. I went through financial crises. I accompanied my husband in difficult decisions when no one else believed in him. Still, after he died, something changed in the way they came to see me. Not as someone experienced, but as someone to be controlled. They started slowly. First, suggestions. Then, unsolicited advice. Then small decisions made for my good. When I realized they were already talking to me as if I was too emotional, too confused, too old, I started to hear phrases that diminished me disguised as care. Let us solve it. This is too much stress for you. You don't have to worry about these things now. And I did. Not out of weakness, but out of tiredness. My relationship with my son became strange, distant, almost protocolary. He no longer asked me for my opinion. He just informed me of decisions made. My daughter-in-law took on a role that was never hers. Organizing, filtering, controlling accesses. I became a decorative presence in life itself. The widowed mother, polite, silent, who smiles and agrees. It was this woman they learned to underestimate. What no one knew is that I always watched everything. Even when he seemed absent, I listened. Even when I agreed, I wrote it down in my mind. Solitude has taught me to pay attention to details that others overlook. A look that lasts too long. A sigh out of turn. A phrase repeated with excess of care. That coffee before the meeting was not the first sign. It was just the most obvious. There was also the weight of the past. Something I never shared with anyone. A truth that I kept for years, not out of fear, but for survival. That truth shaped the family, sustained assets, secured positions. I was the only one who paid the price of silence. And maybe that's why they believed that I would never have the courage to use it. Perhaps they have confused dignity with submission. As I walked to my room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. Not uncontrolled anger, not despair, but a cold lucidity. They thought I was alone, isolated, emotionally fragile. They thought I depended on them to exist. This was the narrative they built, and that I, for a long time, allowed to exist. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman I saw. Not because I was weak, but because I was invisible even to myself. Aging, I learned, is not losing strength. It is learning to hide it so well that others forget that it exists. And that, at that moment, began to become an advantage. I sat up in bed and took a deep breath, remembering who I was before I was reduced to someone in need of help. I remembered the hard decisions, the sleepless nights, the choices that no one else had the courage to make. That woman still existed. I was just silent, a strategic silence. That morning's meeting had not been just an attempt to hurry me up. It was a test. They wanted to see if I would sign without question, if I would obey without resisting. The broken cup got in the way of the plan, but their real mistake was believing that I wouldn't notice. Underestimating someone is always dangerous. Underestimating someone who observes in silence is fatal. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a victim of circumstances. I felt like I was in front of a game, and that I had finally understood the rules. They thought that the power was in their hands. I knew that the real power was in what I had not yet said. That night, I didn't sleep. Not out of fear, but because my mind worked with an almost frightening clarity. Each gesture of the morning took on a new meaning. Every word spoken at the table revealed a hidden intention. And the more I thought, the more evident it became. That attempt to control myself had not begun now. It had been under construction for years. Before turning off the light, I made a silent decision. I wouldn't confront anyone yet. I would not ask for explanations. It would not arouse suspicion. If they wanted to see me as fragile, I would give them just that. But inside, something had changed. The woman they thought was lost was awake, and he didn't intend to sleep again. The next day, I woke up with the strange feeling that I was no longer the master of my own time. Before breakfast my phone rang. It was my son, in that too soft voice, asking if I was okay and casually remembering that we would need to resume the interrupted conversation. He didn't ask if I wanted to, he only informed. The rush was back, disguised as worry. When everyone arrived at my house again, I realized that the atmosphere was different. There was no coffee this time, no exaggerated attempts at kindness. The environment was drier, more direct. The documents reappeared on the table, lined up with almost military precision. It was as if they had learned from the mistake of the previous day, and now wanted to eliminate any distraction that would give me time to think. I sat in the same place, watching every movement. They spoke to each other with quick, silent looks, as if following an invisible script. I no longer heard only words, I heard intentions. Each sentence was carefully chosen to lead me, to gently push me in a direction I wasn't supposed to leave. I realized something that made me freeze inside. That meeting had not been scheduled to discuss options. It existed only to formalize a decision already made. I was the last obstacle, the inconvenient detail that he needed to sign for everything to become legal, definitive, and irreversible. They talked again about safety, about the future, about how it would be too heavy for me to continue dealing with certain responsibilities. They used my name sweetly, as if that made the betrayal less cruel. At no time did they ask what I wanted. At no time did they consider that I could disagree. As they spoke, I noticed how my son avoided looking directly at me. He stared at the table, the papers, anything other than my face. That hurt more than I expected. It wasn't just a contest for control. It was a choice. And he had already chosen a side. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, seemed strangely confident. He spoke confidently, like someone who believes he won even before the game ended. That overconfidence confirmed something important to me. They believed I had no way out, that I was trapped by age, loneliness, and the narrative they built about me. At one point, one of the documents was slid towards me with the pen already positioned on it. A simple, almost polite gesture. But there was the concrete, palpable threat. All it took was a movement of my hand for me to lose control of my house, my finances, my own voice. That's what they wanted to solve quickly. I pretended to have difficulty understanding a passage. I asked them to repeat it. I saw impatience arise, barely disguised. The rush was revealed again. They needed to end it soon. The longer I was late, the more nervous they became. That gave me absolute certainty. Time was on my side, not theirs. As they explained clauses that pretended to be simple, my mind went back to the past, to that secret that I carried alone for so many years, a secret they ignored or believed buried forever. At that moment, I understood why they were in such a hurry. If I had time, if I took a deep breath, if I sought help, everything could collapse for them. I held the pen for a few seconds, just long enough to make them believe they were winning. Then I calmly placed it back on the table. He said he needed more time. That's all. No charges, no long explanation. The silence that followed was tense, almost hostile. There, at that table, it was clear to me that this meeting was not the beginning of the conflict. It was just the first visible move in a silent war that had been raging for years. Out of my sight, or so they thought. As I stood up and ended the conversation, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. They left upset, trying to maintain the facade of cordiality. I was alone in the living room, with the document still on the table. I touched the paper carefully, as if touching something dangerous. I knew that this rush was just the beginning, and I knew too that now I needed to act smart, because the next move wouldn't be theirs, it would be mine. I spent the rest of that day mentally reliving the scene of the cup falling to the floor. The more I thought, the more I realized that this little chaos had been the only thing out of their control. Everything else seemed rehearsed, repeated, trained. The fall, the dry noise of the porcelain breaking, the uncomfortable silence that came after, that was not in the plan. And that was precisely why it became so revealing. I began to reconstruct every detail calmly. The way my daughter-in-law held the tray, too rigid. The way my son took a deep breath, like someone who loses his temper when something goes wrong. The quick glance exchanged between them, loaded with irritation, not concern. It wasn't about the coffee. It never was. It was about the time they lost because of him. I realized that if the meeting had gone on without interruption, I might have given in. Not because he agrees, but because of exhaustion. That second of pause gave me back something that I had been losing little by little: presence. When the glass broke, their mask also cracked. For a few moments, they stopped pretending. The maid came back to my mind more than once. Her nervousness did not combine with a simple domestic accident. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of guilt and fear. It wasn't because he dropped the cup. It was because I knew I had messed up something serious, something big. That realization deeply disturbed me. In the late afternoon, I called her into the living room. I did it naturally, as if asking for a simple favor. She entered hesitantly, avoiding my gaze. I asked if everything was okay. She said yes, too fast. I thanked him for his usual care and said that accidents happen. It was then that I saw his shoulders relax slightly, as if he had been given permission to breathe. I didn't ask anything else, not yet. But in that instant, I confirmed something important. I wasn't the only one to feel that something was wrong. Someone else had noticed the tension, the rehearsal, the haste. And that meant that the truth wasn't as well hidden as they imagined. Alone again, I walked to the kitchen and observed the coffee-stained carpet, still slightly dark despite the cleanliness. That stain bothered me less than it should have. It was almost symbolic, a reminder that sometimes you have to dirty something beautiful to reveal what was hidden underneath. That night was long. I rummaged through old drawers, boxes that I hadn't opened in years. I didn't look for anything specific at first. I just let my hands follow the memory. Photographs, letters, forgotten documents. Each object carried a version of me that they pretended they no longer knew. The woman who made decisions, the woman who kept secrets. When I found what I was looking for, I felt a tightness in my chest. Not of fear, but of confirmation. The past had not disappeared. It was there, intact, waiting just for the right moment to be remembered. I finally understood why this meeting needed to happen so quickly. Time was not only their enemy, it was my accomplice. I sat down at the kitchen table, with the papers scattered in front of me, and took a deep breath. For the first time since my husband's death, I felt that I was not reacting to events. I was anticipating myself. The game had changed, even if they didn't know it yet. The cup drop wasn't just a domestic accident. It was the first crack in the structure they built around me. A small flaw, almost ridiculous, but enough to reveal the nervousness behind the staging. If a simple stumble caused so much discomfort, imagine what the full truth would be able to do. At that moment, I decided that I would no longer allow them to conduct my life in silence. It was not yet time to act openly, but it was time to prepare the ground. They believed that the coffee episode had just been an inconvenient delay. I knew it had been the beginning of something much bigger. I carefully closed the box and put it back in place. Not for fear that they would find it, but for strategy. She smiles to herself, a discreet smile, almost imperceptible. They were in a hurry. I had time. And from that accident that no one planned, that made all the difference. The next morning, I found the documents exactly where they had been left, as if the house had been frozen in time since they left. No one called, no one came back to pick them up. That was not carelessness. It was overconfidence. They believed that I would not move, that I would wait for instructions, that I would continue on the paper they had written for me. I sat down at the table with a cup of tea, not coffee, and spread the papers out before me. He was in no hurry. For the first time, time was a silent ally. I started reading slowly, without trying to understand everything right away. Difficult words did not scare me. What interested me were the patterns, the repetitions, what appeared too many times to be innocent. Right from the first pages, I realized the trick. They did not speak of loss, but of gradual transfer. They did not speak of control, but of legal support. They did not speak of disability, but of future prevention. It was an elegant trap, carefully written to look like protection while slowly tearing away my autonomy. The more I read, the clearer the threat became. If he signed, he wouldn't lose everything at once. He would lose little by little in silence. First, the right to decide. Then, direct access to my accounts. Finally, the house. My home would become just the place where I would live by permission. The idea made me feel a knot in my stomach, not of fear, but of indignation. I stopped at a specific section and reread it 3 times. There was the clause that condemned me without fanfare. It would be enough for 2 of them to judge that I was no longer fit for decisions to be made on my behalf. No independent evaluation, no outside voice, just family, the same family that avoided my eyes while trying to silence me. It was then that I understood something even harder. It had not been thought of in a hurry. That document was the result of months, perhaps years, of planning, meetings to which I was not invited, whispered conversations in hallways, decisions made about me while I believed I was still part of the table. I closed my eyes for a few seconds and took a deep breath. I felt the pain of betrayal mingle with an almost cruel clarity. It wasn't just about financial control. It was an attempt to rewrite my history, to transform the woman who supported that family into a convenient burden, someone to be managed. I got up and walked around the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the memories. Every object there had passed through my hands. Each achievement had been built on difficult choices that no one else had the courage to make. And now they wanted to convince me that I was no longer capable of deciding even about myself. I returned to the table and stacked the papers carefully. I didn't tear anything. I didn't cry. I didn't care about anyone. I kept everything in a simple folder, without identification. Anger didn't overwhelm me. What I felt was something more dangerous: determination. They had made a mistake by letting me read it calmly. At that moment, I was sure that this would not be an emotional battle. It would be strategic. If they used the law to try to take me out of the game, It would be by the law that I would take back control. And to do that, I would need to act smarter than I ever had before. I looked again at the folder and smiled, a restrained, almost imperceptible smile. The document that was supposed to silence me had done the opposite. He had awakened me. Now I knew exactly what was at stake, and exactly why this meeting had to happen in such a hurry. I kept the folder in a safe place and did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote everything down. Dates, phrases, behaviors, looks. Every detail could become a weapon at the right time. They believed I was just an old woman trying to keep up with the world. They had no idea that they had just given me the complete map of their plan. When I finished, I felt a deep tiredness, but also a strange sense of control. The threat was real, concrete, dangerous, but now she had form, and when something takes shape, it can be faced. They didn't know it yet, but that document wouldn't be the end of my voice. It would be the beginning. I spent most of the night awake, sitting at the kitchen table, with the briefcase closed in front of me. I didn't open it again. He didn't need to. What really kept me awake was not the recent documents, but what they never imagined I still held. An old, heavy, silent secret. A secret that has shaped my life more than any public decision I have ever made. Decades ago, when everything was still being built, I made a choice that no one else had the courage to make. A difficult, risky choice that saved that family from an irreversible collapse. At the time, they said it was better to forget. That silence would protect everyone, and I accepted. Not out of submission, but because there were children involved, futures at stake, a stability too fragile to be broken by the truth. Over time, that silence became part of me. I buried the truth deep, where no one could reach it. Not even I touched it often, but I never lost sight of her. I always knew exactly where I was. I always knew that if one day it was necessary, she would still have enough strength to turn everything upside down. As the sky cleared through the window, I remembered how I had been convinced to keep quiet. They used beautiful words, vague promises, and above all, fear. Fear of scandal, fear of ruin, fear of losing everything we had built. At that moment in my life, I accepted to carry the weight alone. I thought I was protecting the family. Today, I see that I was teaching them to underestimate me. The irony is that this same secret was the basis of the patrimony they were now trying to wrest from me. Without that decision of the past, nothing they defended with such confidence would exist. And yet, there they were, treating me as a problem to be solved, an uncomfortable variable to be controlled. I got up and walked slowly to the room where I kept old boxes, the ones that no one had ever been curious to open. I opened one of them carefully, as if touching something alive. Inside, yellowed documents, letters, records that should no longer exist, but existed. Because I never destroyed anything. I just waited. When I touched those papers, I felt a mixture of pain and strength. Pain for everything I swallowed in silence. Strength for knowing that the truth was still whole. They believed I was just a tired widow, lost in time. They had no idea that I was the only person in that family who knew the whole story, from beginning to end. I sat on the floor, surrounded by memories that I had preferred to forget for many years. I realized, with almost cruel clarity, that their haste now made perfect sense. If I had time, if I sought legal help, if someone from the outside analyzed everything calmly, the house of cards would collapse. They weren't just trying to control me, they were trying to protect themselves. I closed the box again with steady hands. It wasn't time to reveal anything yet. Old truths require timing. They demand an audience. They require context. To reveal them too soon would be as big a mistake as never to reveal them. I needed to choose the right time, the right place, the right people. For the first time, I felt sorry for them. Not because they were wrong, but because they believed they were safe. They underestimated not only my intelligence, but my memory. They thought that time erases everything. They did not understand that time only teaches when to use what has been stored. Throughout that day, I started to look at each movement of the family with different eyes. Every call, every message, every attempt to solve it soon. They were restless. The delay bothered them, and the more they pressed, the clearer it became that I was right not to give in. By the end of the afternoon, I realized something essential. I didn't have to act out of revenge. He needed to act for justice. It wasn't about punishing them, but about regaining control of my own narrative. For years, I let myself be put in the role of a fragile woman because it kept the peace. Now, peace had become a prison. As night fell, I made a silent promise to myself. The secret I had buried for decades would no longer be just a burden. It would be my anchor, my protection, my weapon, if I had to. They had started this game thinking that I was the weakest piece on the board. They were about to find out that I was the only one who knew all the rules. Over the next few days, I noticed that someone was watching me more closely than usual. He was not my son, nor my daughter-in-law. It was someone who had always been there, walking around the house in silence, almost invisible. The same person who had knelt down to pick up the shards of the broken cup. That didn't seem like a coincidence to me. She started to appear more often near me, always with some simple pretext. A glass of water, a banal question, a warning too small to justify the interruption. Nothing was straightforward, nothing was explicit, but there was care in every gesture. And more importantly, there was hesitation, as if she wanted to say something and still wasn't sure if she should. One evening, while I was organizing old papers in the room, she came in quietly. She stood there for a few seconds, looking at me, until she said, almost in a whisper, that she didn't think it was right the way they were treating me. He did not accuse anyone. He did not make complaints. He just dropped that sentence in the air and waited for my reaction. I looked up slowly and stared at his face. I saw fear there, but also something rarer, loyalty. I asked him to sit down. He said that accidents happen, but that some falls are not so accidental. She swallowed. That small gesture confirmed everything I had already suspected. It was then that she told what little she knew. Conversations heard by half, broken calls when entering a room, orders given in a low tone, always when they thought I wasn't around. Nothing concrete enough for an accusation, but more than enough to confirm that there was something being prepared away from me. She apologized for not speaking sooner. He said he was afraid of losing his job, afraid of getting in where he shouldn't. I understood. Fear had also been my companion for many years. But in that moment, I realized that I was no longer completely alone. Sometimes the most important allies are those that no one considers relevant. I didn't promise protection. I didn't make speeches. I just thanked her and told her that she had done the right thing. I saw immediate relief on his shoulders. It wasn't just about helping me. It was about lightening the weight of carrying something wrong in silence. I recognized that because I knew that feeling well. After that, our communication started to be done in small signs. A loose comment, a discreet warning, a look that said more than words. She became my eyes and ears when I wasn't there. And I, for the first time, allowed myself to trust someone outside that family nucleus that had been surrounding me for years. Meanwhile, my family continued to act as if everything was under control. They believed that I was just buying time out of insecurity. They did not imagine that while I was feigning fragility, I began to assemble a silent network of information. Every detail mattered. Every strange behavior was written down mentally. I began to realize how easy it is to manipulate those who believe they have already won. They relax. They became careless. They talked more than they should, overconfident in the image of a confused woman they had created about me. That excessive confidence became my greatest advantage. At certain times, I felt guilty. Not for them, but for myself, for having accepted so much for so long. But soon that guilt turned into something more useful: focus. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just letting the truth find its way. My unexpected ally didn't have to do much. His existence already changed everything. Knowing that someone else saw what I saw gave me strength. It confirmed that I wasn't exaggerating, I wasn't paranoid, I wasn't losing my mind, as they silently insinuated. By the end of that week, I no longer felt just threatened. I felt prepared. The woman who everyone thought was fragile now watched the board calmly, aware of each piece. They still believed that I depended on them. Little did they know that I had just found something much more powerful than addiction: consciousness. And it was there that I understood something essential. You can't win a war by making too much noise. Sometimes, victory begins in the shared silence between two people who know something is wrong and decide not to pretend it's okay anymore. After all that I heard and observed, I understood that my greatest protection would not be haste or confrontation, but appearance. They had already decided who I was: a tired, confused, emotionally dependent woman. I realized that fighting this image at that moment would be futile, so I did something they never imagined. I started to use it to my advantage. I began to act exactly as they expected. I asked repeated questions. I forgot small details on purpose. I showed insecurity in simple conversations. I saw relief come up on their faces, barely noticeable but real. Nothing reassures someone more than believing that the other is under control, and I let them believe that. My daughter-in-law started to take up even more space. He organized agendas, decided schedules, spoke for me when he thought it was convenient. I nodded, smiled, thanked. Each gesture of condescension from them gave me more information. The more they talked, the more they revealed. The more confident they became, the more careless they became. Inside, however, I was more alert than ever. Each conversation was mentally recorded. Every change of tone, every word chosen with excessive care. I learned to listen to what was not said. The rush reappeared whenever I showed too much interest. Silence came when I hit the target unintentionally. There were days when I needed to control my anger. Feigning fragility requires discipline. It is swallowing the impulse to defend oneself, to explain oneself, to impose oneself. At times, I felt humiliated. Not because I really was weak, but because I knew I was being underestimated. Still, I continued. He knew that this humiliation was temporary. My ally quickly noticed the change. In our brief glances, there was understanding. I was playing a longer game now. He helped me with small information, strange schedules, unexpected visits, interrupted phone calls when he saw me enter the room. Nothing explicit, but all revealing. I started to move around the house as if I didn't want to bother. That was exactly what they wanted. And that's exactly how I was able to hear conversations that shouldn't be heard, notice movements that shouldn't be seen. Invisibility, I found, can be a powerful form of freedom. At night, when she was alone, the mask would fall off. I sat down with my papers, reviewed old documents, cross-referenced information. The strategic woman reappeared away from their eyes. I wasn't just reacting. I was building something solid, silent, and definitive. With each passing day, it became clearer that they believed they were winning. Loose comments revealed this. They spoke of the after, of when everything was resolved. None of them imagined that I was already planning exactly the same moment, just from a completely different point of view. There was also an internal change that I didn't expect. Feigning fragility forced me to face how much I was pushed into this role over the years. Not only for them, but for a society that confuses aging with losing value. This realization aroused something deeper than anger. It awakened dignity. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone at that moment. It just needed to continue to be underestimated. The more they believed I was lost, the freer I was to act. It was a cruel but efficient paradox. They thought they were leading me. Little did they know that they were just making way. I quietly accepted the role I was given, knowing it was temporary. The frail woman was just a mask. Behind her, the real me watched, calculated, and waited. And when it was finally time to rip off that mask, there would be no way to put it back on. It didn't take long for their haste to start getting too explicit. Frequent calls, messages asking if I had thought better, unexpected visits with the excuse of seeing how I was. Everything was wrapped up in care, but nervousness escaped through the cracks. The longer I put off any decision, the more impatient they became. And impatience is always revealing. I began to respond with calculated slowness. I said I was tired, that I needed to reread the documents, that my head was not good that day. I saw the discomfort grow in their eyes, especially my son's. There was something almost desperate about his attempt to maintain control of the situation. That hurt me, but it also confirmed that I was right not to give in. On one of these visits, my daughter-in-law lost her temper for a moment. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. A longer sigh, a hard look that was soon replaced by a forced smile. She talked about deadlines, commitments, people waiting, people, not family. That word echoed in my mind as a warning. I asked, feigning naivety, why such urgency? The silence that followed was heavy. They exchanged glances before answering, as if they needed to align the story. They said it was better to solve it soon to avoid problems in the future. Problems for whom, I thought. For me or for them? After they left, I sat alone in the room and let the distrust turn to certainty. That plan wasn't just aimed at getting me out of control. There was something external pressing, a deadline that did not depend on me, a risk they didn't want to take. The rush was no longer just uncomfortable, it was suspicious. My ally confirmed this days later, in a few words spoken almost without moving his lips. He commented on tense phone calls, on names he didn't recognize, on conversations that ended abruptly when I showed up. I didn't need any more details. It was enough to understand that there were more people involved than I imagined. I started to observe even more carefully. Each visit now seemed like an attempt to hasten the inevitable. They spoke of my well-being, but their bodies betrayed anxiety. Restless hands, higher voices, repeated phrases. The mask of worry was beginning to crack. Interestingly, the more they pressed, the calmer I became. Clarity brings an uncanny serenity. I no longer wondered if I was exaggerating. I knew it wasn't. I knew that this rush was the biggest sign that I was on the right track. If there was nothing to hide, they would not be afraid of time. I started to test limits. He asked more direct questions, but always with a soft tone. I watched how they dodged, how they changed the subject. Each evasion was written down mentally. They believed I wouldn't notice. They did not understand that, in that game, their silence spoke louder than any confession. There was a specific moment when everything fell into place. My son mentioned, without realizing it, A date. A date that didn't make sense to me, but that clearly mattered to them. I kept it like someone who keeps a key. I still didn't know which door I would open, but I knew I would open one. That night, I revisited my old documents once again. I cross-referenced dates, names, records. The past began to talk to the present in a frighteningly logical way. The secret I kept was not only relevant, it was urgent, and they knew it, even if they didn't know I still had it. From then on, I stopped being just cautious. I became strategic. Their haste had become my compass. Whenever they rushed something, I knew there was truth there. Whenever they avoided it, I knew there was fear. It was simple, and it was powerful. As I lay down that night, I felt something close to relief. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I now saw the complete drawing. They weren't just trying to control me. They were running against something, and for the first time, I knew exactly how to use it to my advantage. The next morning, I made a decision that I had been putting off for years. I picked up the phone and called someone I hadn't seen in a long time. It was not a relative. He was not a close friend. It was someone who knew the whole story, the way it really happened, and who had participated in it when everything was still being built. The call was brief, to the point, and ended with a phrase that brought me immediate calm. I still have everything. I hung up feeling the weight of the past reorganize itself inside me. What had always been just memory now took concrete form again. It was no longer just an emotional secret, but something that could be proved, shown, analyzed. Something that didn't depend only on my word. For the first time, I realized that I didn't have to face it alone. I spent the rest of the day gathering papers. Some had been with me for decades, guarded with almost obsessive care. Others arrived by text, by email, by discreet envelopes left where no one else would see. Each document seemed to fit perfectly into the other, as if they were waiting for that moment to be gathered. As he organized everything, the dimension of what was at stake became even clearer. It was not just an attempt to remove me from the control of my assets. It was about hiding serious mistakes, illegal decisions, dangerous shortcuts that had been taken in the past and that now sustained their comfortable present. The haste, after all, was not my paranoia. It was real fear. I felt a pang of sadness as I realized that my son was a part of this in a deeper way than I had imagined. Not just as someone manipulated, but as someone who chose not to ask questions. He chose to believe in the most convenient version. That realization hurt more than any financial threat, but it also freed me from one last illusion. My ally remained attentive, bringing small but valuable information. He commented on an unexpected visit from a lawyer, about a tense call that ended abruptly, about a muffled argument in the kitchen. Every detail confirmed that the siege was closing in, for them. With everything organized, I sat down in front of the table and watched that pile of papers. For the first time, I felt no fear of what might happen if the truth came out. I felt respect for myself. That woman they thought was fragile had actually been the silent basis of it all. And now he had proof of it. I understood that the tables had turned at the exact moment I stopped just reacting. Now I had options. I could negotiate, I could expose, could wait. The power was no longer in their hands, and that completely changed the dynamic. Urgency no longer pressured me. It pressed them. I kept the documents in a different folder from the previous one, more organized, more accessible. It was no longer something to be hidden. It was something to be used at the right time, and the right moment was approaching faster than they imagined. That night, when my son called again, I was cordial. He said he was still thinking, that he needed more time. I heard the tension in his voice, barely disguised. I hung up with the certainty that he felt that something had gotten out of control, even without knowing exactly what. Before I went to sleep, I looked around the room and realized how different everything looked. The house was the same, the objects the same, but I wasn't. I no longer felt cornered. I felt prepared. The truth now was not just a weight of the past. It was the missing piece. I turned off the light with a calm I hadn't felt in years. He knew that the confrontation was approaching. I knew it would be public, difficult, and painful. But I also knew that when the time came, I wouldn't be asking for anything. I would just be putting the truth on the table. And this time, no one would be in a hurry enough to shut me up. I realized that something had definitely changed in me the moment I stopped asking for approval. I didn't announce decisions. I didn't share doubts. I didn't seek advice within the family. I simply started to act. It was as if, for years, I had lived in a reduced space, and now I occupied my entire size again, albeit in silence. I started with small attitudes. I made appointments without telling anyone. I reorganized accounts, reviewed accesses, recovered old passwords. None of this raised immediate suspicions, because they continued to believe that I misunderstood these issues. Their underestimation remained my greatest shield. I started to leave the house more, always with simple justifications. Medical appointments, walks, shopping. In fact, each exit had a clear purpose. Discreet conversations, signatures, technical guidance. I didn't have to improvise anymore. Now there was a plan. And a plan, when done well, brings an almost frightening tranquility. I noticed the change in their behavior as well. Excessive confidence was beginning to give way to uncomfortable caution. My daughter-in-law asked too many indirect questions. My son tried to probe my mood more often. They felt that something was out of place, but they couldn't identify what, and that made them uneasy. Curiously, I did not feel pleasure in this inversion of power. It was not revenge that moved me. It was a necessity. For a long time, I accepted less than I deserved to keep the peace. Now I understood that that peace was false, built on my silence. Regaining control was not an aggressive act. It was a late adjustment. At times, I thought about confronting them directly. Say it all at once. Expose every lie, every plan, every betrayal. But I soon realized that this would be handing over the rhythm of the situation to them. I no longer needed to react emotionally. It needed to be precise. And precision requires calm. My ally was still attentive, but now he hardly needed to bring information. I already knew where to look. I already understood the patterns, the schedules, the movements. It was like learning a new language. Once you understand the logic, everything becomes clearer. The fear that had previously accompanied me had become a focus. There was a specific day when I realized that the old version of me would not come back. I was sitting at the table, listening to my daughter-in-law explain something for the third time, as if I couldn't understand. I smiled, thanked him, and agreed. Inside, however, I felt only distance. There was no more pain in that gesture, just observation. This emotional distance was liberating. I stopped expecting recognition, affection, or regret. When you stop waiting, the other loses power. And that's exactly what happened. Their words began to ring hollow. Attempts at control were ineffective. I started to sleep better. I woke up clearly, not anxiously. He knew exactly what he was doing and why. The woman who started this story feeling cornered no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood her own worth and didn't need to announce it. I understood then that strength is not raising one's voice or imposing presence. Strength is not having to explain yourself anymore. And I had reached that point. The woman who everyone thought was fragile now led each step with full awareness of the consequences. The confrontation was approaching, I knew. There was no way to avoid it. But contrary to what I imagined at the beginning, I was not afraid. I felt prepared. Everything he needed was in the right place. The right words, the right evidence, the right time. When I looked in the mirror that night, I didn't see the tired widow they insisted on seeing. I saw someone who had gone through silence, betrayal, and underestimation without breaking down. From then on, I would no longer ask for permission to exist. And when the truth came out, it would not be like a request. It would be like a fact. What comes now is the hardest part to share, because talking about it means reliving choices that cost me family, silence, and years of my own voice. Exposing this moment does not bring me relief. It brings risk, but also truth. If you've come this far with me, it's because you understand that some stories need to be told even when they hurt. So I ask you, sign up, not as a support for me, but as an act so that voices like this are not erased when they finally have the courage to speak. The invitation to the final meeting arrived disguised as concern. My son said he wanted to solve everything at once, that it was better for everyone, that I would be calmer later. I listened in silence, as always. I agreed. He said he would be there. On the other end of the line, I felt the immediate relief. They believed they had finally succeeded. The meeting would no longer be at my house. This in itself said a lot. They chose a neutral, formal office, full of light walls and uncomfortable chairs. A place where they felt protected, supported, in control. When I arrived, everyone was already there. My son, my daughter-in-law, a lawyer I didn't know, and two people who had never participated in any conversation before. Too many people for something that should be simple. I sat calmly, without showing nervousness. I observed the environment as someone who arrives early at a show and has time to analyze the stage. The papers were already organized. The pens, aligned. The rush was there again, silent, hanging in the air. They wanted to wrap it up quickly before anything went off script. They began to speak almost immediately. The lawyer used technical terms. My daughter-in-law completed with explanations in simple language, and my son reinforced that everything was for my good. I listened, nodded, asked irrelevant little questions. Their every answer confirmed that they believed they were safe, that there were no more surprises. At one point, they pushed the documents in my direction again. The same elegant trap, now with witnesses. The pen rested in front of me, heavy. I waited a few seconds before touching it. The silence bothered more than any words. They didn't like breaks. Pauses gave room for the unexpected. When I finally spoke, my voice came out firm, more than I expected. He said that he had understood everything, but that before signing, he needed to clarify a detail. Only one. The lawyer smiled condescendingly. He said he was available. It was there that I felt the tables turn. I opened my folder and pulled out the first few documents. I didn't make speeches. I didn't raise my voice. I just put the papers on the table one by one. The lawyer's smile disappeared first. Then, my daughter-in-law's. My son turned pale. The silence that formed was no longer one of impatience. It was one of recognition. I calmly explained what those documents represented: dates, decisions, responsibilities. I connected the past to the present with a clarity that they didn't expect from me. I didn't have to accuse anyone directly. The truth accused itself. Each leaf exposed, dismantled a part of the story they had been telling for years. The lawyer asked for a few minutes to analyze everything. For the first time, the rush changed sides. Now they were the ones who needed time. I watched as they whispered, as they tried to rearrange arguments that no longer held. Control had slipped out of their hands, and everyone there knew it. My son tried to speak, explain, justify. I asked him to stop. Not with harshness, but with authority. He said that conversation was no longer emotional. It was factual, and facts do not discuss feelings. He was silent. I had never seen him like this in front of me. When the meeting ended, nothing was signed. Nothing was decided there. But something had changed irreversibly. They did not come out winners. They came out exposed. The attempt to control me had turned into a real threat against themselves. And everyone in that room understood this clearly. As I left the building, I felt the air lighter. Not because everything was resolved, but because the confrontation they had avoided so much had finally happened. On my terms, at my pace. The woman who came in there as someone to be taken care of, left as someone who needed to be taken seriously. I knew there were still consequences ahead. Processes, decisions, ruptures. But at that moment, a certainty settled in me with absolute force. They would never again dare to treat me as fragile. And that, regardless of the outcome, was already a victory. In the days following that meeting, there was almost absolute silence. No rushed calls, no unexpected visits, no attempts to talk better. It was a silence different from the others. Not comfortable, but cautious. The kind of silence that arises when someone realizes that they have said too much and now measures each step for fear of making a mistake again. It didn't take long for the next stage to impose itself. The confrontation would not be restricted to that closed room. There were too many documents, too many people, and too many interests involved for everything to be swept under the rug. Truth, once placed on the table, gains a will of its own, and it began to circulate. I was called to a formal hearing a few weeks later. This time, there was no attempt to spare me or lead me. I was summoned as a central part of the story. I sat in front of people who had never seen me as the mother, the widow, or the frail woman. There, I was just someone with facts, evidence, and memory intact. When I started to speak, I felt something curious happen inside me. There was no nervousness. There was no tremor. Each word came out at the right time, with the exact weight. I told the story from the beginning, without flourishes, without victimhood. I narrated decisions, choices, silences. The secret that I had carried for decades finally gained air, light, and witnesses. I watched my son as I spoke. He avoided my gaze, but there was no more anger on his face. There was something closer to shame. My daughter-in-law maintained a rigid posture, as if trying to sustain a version that no longer holds. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to confront them directly. The exhibition did that for me. The documents circulated among hands that were now analyzing them seriously. Questions were asked, dates confirmed, contradictions pointed out. Each answer reinforced what I had always known. The truth may be ignored for a while, but it never goes away. She just waits for the moment when she can no longer be contained. When it was all over, the atmosphere was loaded, heavy, irreversible. Nothing there could be unsaid. There were no screams, no hysterical accusations, only observations. And findings changed destinies with frightening efficiency. The narrative that painted me as incapable had been publicly dismantled. As I left that place, I felt a deep tiredness, but also an unexpected lightness. Not because I had beaten anyone, but because I no longer had to carry alone what was imposed on me for so many years. The truth, finally, was no longer just my responsibility. I learned later that decisions were reviewed, agreements suspended, plans undone. I didn't follow everything closely. He didn't need to. What mattered had already happened. The woman who was brought to that situation as someone to be controlled had become a central reference in the process. No one could erase that. At home, the silence continued, but now it was different. There were no more messages trying to rush me. There were no more speeches disguised as care. There was distance. And curiously, I didn't suffer from it. Some distances are necessary to breathe better. For the first time, I understood that telling the truth out loud is not an act of aggression. It is an act of liberation, even when it hurts, even when it breaks structures, even when it changes relationships forever. The price of silence had been too high. The price of truth, though bitter, was just. That night, I sat alone in the room, in silence, and realized that something had ended. Not a war, but an old version of myself. The woman who endured everything so as not to displease no longer existed. In her place, there was someone who understood with absolute clarity her own worth. The truth had been told, out loud, in front of everyone, and from that moment on, nothing could ever be the same again, including me. The decisions began to arrive in a cold, technical way, without any dramatization. Signed papers, formal communications, legal adjustments that confirmed what I already knew. I had won. I kept control of my assets, my house, my autonomy. Nothing could be decided without me. Still, there was no celebration. Victories like this do not ask for applause. They ask for silence. My son showed up a few days later. He did not warn. He just arrived, standing at the door, as someone who no longer knew if he was allowed to enter. His face looked older, tired. I didn't hug him. I didn't send him out either. I just invited him to sit down. There were things that needed to be said even if there was no more possible fix. He tried to explain himself. He spoke of fear, of pressure, of thinking he was doing his best. I listened to everything without interrupting. I didn't discuss versions. I didn't correct facts. Some explanations come too late to change anything. When it ended, silence settled between us. Heavy, definitive. I said only that he had made a choice, and that choices have consequences. My daughter-in-law didn't come. He sent short, calculated messages, trying to maintain a cordiality that no longer existed. I didn't answer. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. Some relationships end not with fights, but with distance. And that distance was necessary for me to be able to remain whole. The house looked different now. Not because it was empty, but because it was finally mine. I walked through the rooms with a strange feeling of renewed possession, as if I were entering there for the first time without asking permission. Each object seemed to carry a new meaning, free from the constant threat of being torn away from me. There were moments of sadness, of course. Betrayal does not disappear just because it is exposed. It leaves marks. Sometimes I found myself remembering who my son was, who I thought he was. I allowed myself to feel this pain without trying to hasten the end of it. Some losses do not require immediate overcoming. They demand respect. Curiously, I didn't feel guilty, not even when I thought about how everything could have been different. I did what I could, when I could, with the tools I had. To remain silent any longer would have been to give up on myself. And that, I now knew, would have been the greatest betrayal of all. People around me started to treat me differently. Not with pity, not with condescension, with real care, carefully. The image of the fragile woman had been replaced by something more solid. I didn't have to demand respect. He just came. Some nights, I would sit alone and think about the price of that victory. He existed. Broken relationships, irreparable affections, a family that would never be the same again. But there was also something new growing in its place. Peace. Not the false peace that comes from imposed silence, but the honest peace that is born when one ceases to live under threat. I understood then that not every victory brings immediate joy. Some bring relief, others, freedom. Mine brought maturity. There was no classic happy ending, no complete reconciliation. There was reality. And surprisingly, I was okay with that. At that stage of life, I realized that I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. It didn't need to be forgiven, understood, or justified. I had protected myself. That was enough. And no one could take that away from me. The victory had been real, but there was no celebration, just a different, cleaner, more honest silence. A silence that, for the first time in many years, did not oppress me. It sustained me. If this story touched you on any level, share this video with someone who may be living something similar in silence. What has been told here is not an isolated case, but a reflection of patterns that normalize betrayal, control, and invisibility, especially within families. Sharing is an act of solidarity. It can be the push someone needs to realize that they are not alone and that there is still a way out. I'll stay here reading each comment carefully. Tell me, from which city or country you are watching this, and what of this story has stayed with you? because knowing that these words reach someone really means more to me than you think.